Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, talking sales with Scott Sambucci. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is Jeremy Macleod. Jeremy is the co-founder of the SearchX, the searchex.com, which is short for the search experience. Jeremy is a Kiwi. He's a New Zealander who is right now living in Sydney, and he and his team are split between his time in Australia and New Zealand and the rest of his team in San Francisco. And back in the olden days when we could travel across continents, he would split his time between London, Sydney, and San Francisco. For now, he's mostly based in Sydney. He works with some of the most exciting teams and businesses in the world, people just like you, startups. In particular, he works with early stage hyper growth startups, disruptors who understand the value of top talent. And even more specifically, he and his team focus on recruiting and helping to build sales and marketing teams at early stage, growth stage startups. Right now, as a course of the last couple of months, there's been obviously a lot of changes in terms of how do you recruit talent? How do you find the talent that you need? What is the right role that you should be hiring for as part of your startup? And in today's conversation with Jeremy, we talked about a couple of those specific questions, and he really did a great job detailing some of the answers to those exact questions that you had. Just to give you a preview of some of the topics that we talked about, one of the questions that I asked him is, when is it the right time? What is the signal for an early stage company? You know, a company that's just getting into that first million in revenue or going from 1 to 3 in revenue. What are the signals to indicate that it's time to hire a sales leader? And we talked about that for quite a bit. Then we also talked about, what is the role? Like, what is the title? What is the job to be done in that first sales leader? And we talked about the difference between a player coach, a head of sales, a VP of sales, and a chief revenue officer. We spent quite a bit of time talking about that player coach role and that head of sales role, and how, as he explained it, how you want to allow yourself the room to hire above those initial sales leaders in your organization if it's necessary. So dove in deep around the details in that $0 to $1 million range, that $1 to $3 million range, and specifically, what are the expectations around that first sales leader? What can you expect from them? Are they quota carrying? How do they manage teams? How do you vet out and find those kinds of player coaches and early head of sales people that are going to help you grow out of that early stage and into that ramp up and scale up phase of your business? From there, we also talked about the importance of recruiting and hiring, and specifically, how do you recruit and hire in today's environment where everyone is remote? You know, gone are the days, at least for now, where, you know, you have that great candidate come in and meet the team for the day, and you do the lunch and you have the dinner, you go out for a beer, or you go out for a coffee, and really give that person a chance to understand your culture and for you to see how they fit into that culture. So now that we're doing all of the interviewing, all of the hiring online, on Zoom, how do you manage that sales? Manage that sales hiring process? What does that look like now that you can't do the all-day event with people? What's the speed at which you should be hiring and running your hiring process? Because it can go much faster now that we have Zoom, and you don't have to worry about getting people on airplanes and getting them to spend a day with you. But on the other hand, that speed is sometimes a negative when it comes to getting that person to come on board with you and your team. So we dove deep into that as well. And finally, we talked about the idea of hiring remote and how remote should that person be. We're all remote right now. So does that mean that your candidate has to be remote but still able to get back to an office if you decide to reopen your office in the coming months and years? Or can it be truly remote, that they're always going to be remote, where you have an office in San Francisco and your head of sales or your VP of sales is based in Miami or New York or Austin? So these are all the questions that we're getting every day. And I wanted to make sure that we got those answered for you. And Jeremy was exactly the person to answer those questions for you and for us here in today's episode. So if you're hiring or thinking about hiring your first sales leader or your next sales leader, this is absolutely the right place for the next 45 minutes or so. So buckle up, enjoy, and let's head over my conversation with Jeremy Macleod.
Great to finally connect to do this thing. Apologies that I had to reschedule from the previous time, but
not at all. Our best guests are the people that are hardest to get a hold of. I'm looking across the ocean longingly, wishing I was back in New Zealand.
Oh, nice. Well, I'd love to say that I was talking to you from sunny Sydney, but it's actually completely miserable outside today. So it's not putting his best summer foot forward.
Yeah. So how often and you're in Sydney now, but how often do you get back to New Zealand? Because that's where you're from, right?
Yeah. So the intention is to get back and forth 3 or 4 times a year, but at the moment, New Zealand won't allow anybody from Australia to travel there without going into quarantine, and you have to pay for quarantine yourself. So it's really frustrating because my wife and I had a baby. We had our second baby 7 months ago, and my parents still haven't been able to get across to meet their latest granddaughter, which sucks. But look, you understand it with all the precautions. And New Zealand is normal life at the moment. Like, everyone's jumping on planes, everyone's at football stadiums, concerts, you name it. It's kind of this utopia of COVID doesn't exist. So
I know that's why I'm so jealous of it.
I know.
I was there earlier this year, which feels like 3 years ago. And I look now, we have clients that are based there. We have 5 or 6 teams that are based in New Zealand, and we do Zoom calls with them, and they're in the office, and
I know
around and nobody wearing masks. And I'm like,
it's really. I talked to my dad, and he's like, "Oh, I'm jumping on a plane to head down to Wellington. I'm going to Auckland," and I'm like, it seems so odd to think of doing that, whereas that was such a normality for everybody. It's like, oh, what? You're jumping on a plane? That planes are flying every day? Like, that seems crazy. But look, Australia's, I think, we're in Sydney 26 days without a case, other than people coming back into the country. So doing pretty well. Like, things seem relatively normal here.
Yeah.
They're going back to more or less full capacity in most places. And I think once as a country we hit 28 days, then New Zealand will allow us to go there with no quarantine. So, which will be really nice. Because, the whole point of moving back from the States was be close to the grandparents and parents and get to spend lots of time with family. And 2020 has put paid to that. So fingers crossed for 2021.
Yeah, tell me about it. Or if you live in the States, fingers crossed for 2022.
Yeah. Well, I was, because obviously all my colleagues are still in San Francisco in the States, and like they see, 10 plus moving trucks every day, and people are just deserting the Bay Area en masse. And I genuinely don't know if I'll be there in 2021, which is really sort of hard to think about, because I was expecting to be back and forth probably 3 or 4 times a year, and, just getting to spend time with the team more or less, not just getting to see customers and kind of building the network there and continuing to build it, but just seeing the team and being a part of the team. And unless things change in a real hurry, I don't foresee being there in 2021, which is quite sad to think about.
Well, I think that would be a really great place for us to start the conversation, if you're good with diving in at their point.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, that's what you do is help teams you talk about teams, and that's what you do is help teams grow. People that have gotten to this point of our conversation have already listened a little bit to the introduction that I'll have done after we spoke. So they have some context, but I'd love to hear a little bit more. Like, when people ask you, what do you do? How do you describe that to people?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, I guess recruitment it's one of these really misunderstood sort of industries. I think, like, it's depending on which country you're in, recruitment is seen very differently. But essentially what we view as what we do at the Search Experience is finding that absolute top layer of talent that people are fighting desperately to get, and introducing them to really exciting companies that are in hyper growth mode or looking to start that growth phase, and connecting them to see whether it looks as though to be a really good fit, and getting, very deep with companies so that we essentially are their brand in market. Because quite often at the stage of companies we're dealing with, they have very little in the way of HR, they have limited internal recruitment resource, and quite often for founders in particular, they haven't done a lot of recruitment themselves. So they're not really sure, like, they've been part of a team and they've maybe interviewed, but they've not had to build a structure and build a team out. And so we help them understand, what does a good process look like? How do you recruit people well? Because I think it's a really varying process for a lot of different organizations. And there's definitely, you see a lot of success differences based on good and bad processes, and trying to help people understand, this is a really good process. Here's some changes we would make to your current process, and that's going to help you get the best talent, which at the end of the day is going to make the biggest difference in your organization. If you have the best technology in the world or the worst technology in the world, it kind of doesn't matter unless you have the best team that can really take you to the next level. And so we see, the part that we play in helping those businesses grow is really putting almost the most important piece into the puzzle, which is the talent that they have to go out to market and do all of the things they need.
Yeah, when you think about tech startups and tech founders, typically they're engineers or product people as a background. And so when we start working with teams, oftentimes it's the founder that's sort of leading sales, and they feel like, man, it's like so hard. I got to figure out how to sell. So they okay, now I know how to sell my thing. Whew, I'm done. And it's like, well, now you have to learn how to make it repeatable. And they go and make it repeatable. And they're like, oh, I'm done. Then they realize, no, I have to hire some salespeople to help run these systems. And they do that. And they're like, oh, I'm done. Then they realize I got to hire leaders of those salespeople, VPs. And so it's like the work is never done when it comes to sales and growth. It's like every phase has its new challenge.
Yeah. And it's almost, you kind of think I'm through the difficult part now. Now's the easy part, but every layer has more complexity to it as well. I mean, yes, the early stages are difficult because you're grinding and you're trying to get those first sales out there, like you say, and you're trying to get people to use the product and like it and pay for it. And then you think, right, as soon as we have a team, that becomes the easy part. But then you've got managing of people, and, that brings its own complexity, and you have structure to put in place, and you have people to keep happy, which is, that's a really difficult thing to do in a fast growing technology business. And I 100% agree. Like, the challenges never stop. They just change in the complexity. And every time you think, okay, that was the tough part, you get a new part and you're like, oh, hang on a minute, this is the difficult part. Why did I not know this was the hard part? That was the easy part. Take me back there. Let's go back to being a 20-person team, because I knew everybody and I could keep everyone happy and we were all friends, and that was great. And now I have 200 people and I don't know everybody's name and I don't know how to interact with everybody. And, I've got so many different personalities. So but that's the fun of it as well. And that's why I love doing what we do, because these companies, through these various stages, they change so much, and the founders change so much, and they grow, and you get to be part of that growth journey as you do, and no doubt why you're addicted to what you do as well.
All right, folks, we are off and running in my conversation with Jeremy Macleod. We're spending a lot of time today talking about that ramp up phase from 0 to 1 million, 1 million to 3 million. And hey, that's what we do every single day here at Sales Qualia. We work with early stage, growth stage companies to help them through those key inflection points in their growth, getting that first million in revenue, getting from 1 to 3, getting from 3 to 10. So when it comes to building repeatable sales systems, building out that first team, understanding the metrics that you need to be measuring and monitoring each and every day, how do you manage that team that you're hiring and that we're talking about today? Those are all the things that we do every single day with our clients in our Startup Selling Coaching Program. And so if you are in that stage, if you're a B2B tech startup, if you're a startup founder, and you're looking for some ideas, you're looking for some help, and you know that it would be just much more, it would go a lot faster to work with a team like us to help you understand the systems you need to build, how to implement those systems, how to go out and find the talent that you need are going to run that repeatable, predictable, scalable sales process, then maybe we should have a conversation. Easiest way to do that is just shoot me a quick email. You can just shoot me an email at Scott, SCOTT, at salesqualia, QUALIA.com. Scott at salesqualia.com. And easiest thing to do in the subject line, just type the word private. Just type the word private, and that will tell me that you want to have a quick conversation in private about your situation and whether or not our team here at Sales Qualia can help you to ramp up and scale up your sales and sales process. So that's it for now. Shoot me a note. Let's have a quick chat. And if I can help you, you can spend some more time together. And if I can't, I'll do my very best to point you in the right direction. All right, that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation with Jeremy Macleod. Yeah, so when you sort of think about this top level talent, maybe where I'd like to zero in the conversation is a question that we're getting a lot just from our client base, because as they're growing through those initial phases of going from under $1 million to hitting the magic $1 million in ARR, and then getting from 1 to 3, 3 to 10, like in that range is where most teams start thinking through, okay, I need to get a head of sales or a VP of sales. Sometimes they refer to those differently on purpose. In other cases, it's I got to hire a chief revenue officer. And so I would really love to get your perspective on this. And I know it's not necessarily an easy, short answer, but like, when should a enterprise B2B company, what are some signals to know it's time to bring in not just an SDR, a couple SDRs, or some CS people, or an account executive, but when is it time to bring in that leader that's going to lead the team?
It's a really great question. And I think the best way to answer that is to say that there's almost no too early stage to bring in a senior leader who's going to lead your sales organization. It's the type of person that you bring in to lead that sales organization, and realizing that the person that does your 0 to 1, 0 to 5 probably won't be your person that does your 5 to 10 and your 10 beyond, and being comfortable with the fact that you'll transition through leaders who have got experience setting up different parts of that process, because it's very rare that you'll find somebody who has been all the way from 0 to 100 million in revenue and they want to go back and do the 0 to 1, 0 to 3 stuff again, because once they get to that point, it's kind of, well, this is where I'm playing now. I don't want to go back down to that level unless, you've got an amazing pitch to them, or them, or, they just happen to be kicking around looking for something where they want to get into that early stage. So I think it's realizing what is the skill set you need for that 0 to 1, 0 to 3. Bringing in the leader is actually really important, because what we see happen in a lot of organizations is when you try and just hire those individual contributors, the CEO and founders, they get sucked into that sales leadership position, which is not necessarily their forte. And as you say, they're learning as they go anyway. They're not used to understanding the cadence of managing sales reps. And so that can then lead to either sort of overly generous environments where it's really difficult to scale because you've made it far too comfortable for the people, or you start churning people because they're not reporting into a proven sales leader. So they don't feel as though they're learning from a proven leader who's developing their career. So we quite often say to businesses, look, just if you get the right leader, bring them in early and then let them build the team, because they should really be guiding what your sales culture is and what these people are doing on a daily basis. Free yourself up to do other things. Let the professionals take care of leading that sales team, but know that you will probably outgrow that person as a business, and then you'll need to make another hire. And so, as you say, do you call it a head of sales, and then you have a VP of sales that comes in over that person, and then you have a CRO that comes in over that person, and kind of allowing yourself that room. So being very mindful of the titles that you give people in a business also helps remove some of that awkwardness of, okay, because we're a 5-person business, there tends to be this need to give away VP titles really early, because because we're a small business, everybody's the VP of this, that, and everything else. So be mindful of that. Draw up what your structure is going to be when you're a 100-person business, and figure out what are the roles you're going to have, and where are the people in that early stage going to be within that broader business. And that's not to say that person can't grow, but you just need to build the ability for them to stretch into the role, and then the next role, or you hire somebody who's going to come in and do it.
So for those earlier stages, the 0 to 1 million, the 1 to 3 million, one of the questions that I get a lot is, am I hiring somebody who's properly just are they just managing, or are they, you hear the term player coach,
yep,
where they're carrying a quota while managing other people.
Yep.
And there's pros and cons to both, right? The management piece is obviously you as the CEO don't have to worry about managing salespeople, but
Yep.
now you've got somebody who's effectively a cost center because they're not converting deals. The player coach, now you've got somebody who might be straddling and losing focus on not being able to do the quota piece really well because they're trying to coach other people. And so what is your perspective on that? How do you coach your clients through what decisions to make and how to frame the position and what the actual roles and duties are?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because the player coach has almost taken on a bit of it's almost got a bit of a dirty reputation where you can't do both well. And I disagree with that. I think there are people out there that can be a very good player coach who can sell, they can handle a limited number of accounts, but they can still lead a sales team, and they very much have that lead from the front style when it comes to management of their people, which I think in the early stages, having a player coach is actually a really important part of the process, because I agree, having a big cost center where you purely have a management layer that isn't contributing to your revenue can be a big drag. So it's all about finding the right talent and looking at people that have done a player coach role. So going into their background and making sure that this is something that they have successfully done previously, rather than taking a really good account executive who wants to step into a leadership role and thinking, okay, they'll be able to do both, or somebody who's been a manager who says, you know what, I'm happy to roll my sleeves up. It's been 15 years since I did frontline sales, but hey, how different can it be from 15 years ago? And I've been managing people. So it's just getting that good recency of people doing it. And I'm recruiting roles even in organizations that you would say are quite large, where they might have started a new team. So they've got player coaches for a new area within the business. And there are definitely people in market that have that skill set and are very good at both selling and also managing a team. There does come a tipping point of how big that team can get before you need someone to step back and be a manager. And it's usually around that 6 to 7 people in a team. It becomes more difficult to sell and to manage. But up until that point, I think people can manage both.
So are there any minimal acceptable standards that you would consider to be the past experience on player coach? In the sense, like if I'm looking at this just purely from an objective standpoint and I'm trying to evaluate whether or not somebody could be a player coach for us, what should they at least have done to qualify as experienced in a player coach role? Because I think it could be easy to say, well, I was an account executive, but I was coaching all the SDRs at our old company. So I've done some player coach stuff before. And it's like, maybe, but it's not the same as what we're describing, where you are truly straddling. You have the quota that you've got to convert, plus you are truly managing. Yep. So are there ways to think about that, or minimum?
Yeah, so it's just, I guess it's having a very clearly defined managerial role. So where you are, you might be a regional sales manager or a regional sales director, and you were quota carrying. And you can break this down with candidates in an interview process where you can go into the detail of what their individual contribution was, what the team quota was, how much they had to sell. Was it, did they have an individual number that was exclusively theirs, or more commonly, and what I think is probably a better structure, is you just have a team goal that you contribute to, and the percentage that you contribute to it becomes a little bit redundant. If your team is doing really well and you're spending a lot of your time managing and helping them with deals, and you hit the overall number, what they sell almost doesn't matter, because as long as your team is hitting the quota number, that's great. And then if they contribute a good amount, then you start to look at it and say, okay, well, overall as a team, we've hit our number, but we probably need to have a look at the performance of our individual players, because we are fairly heavily weighted to, that player manager who might have some really great relationships and has been able to bring in revenue because of pre-existing relationships. So it's just breaking down that they were very defined as a manager, but also a contributor, not just mentoring, because you do hear a lot of account executives talk about mentoring other people within the team, more junior people, SDRs, as you say, but you need it to be a clearly defined managerial role where they're sitting down and they're having performance conversations, because, as a salesperson, a sales leader, that's the most difficult thing to do is, sit down with your reps, particularly when they're not performing well, and try and turn them around. So, ask for examples where they've turned around underperforming sales reps in their team. If they can't tell you that they've done that and their sales reps have always hit their target, I would say, yeah, I don't know if I believe you, because very rarely do all sales reps hit their targets. So it's just, how you ask certain questions and get some good examples from them. That's the sort of piece that you want to be really clear on, so that you feel as though they can step into that role and it's not, as you say, someone that's done some selling but maybe has more been mentoring than officially managing.
Yeah, I think you could just ask some direct questions around that, like how do you run performance reviews? Yeah. How did you do coaching? And like your question around, tell me about a place where you've turned a rep around or how to let somebody go. Those are all obvious signals that either you've done it or you haven't. And if you haven't, then you haven't been a player coach.
Exactly.
And so let's say you get that person in. Now I'm thinking through the procession of new challenges. So let's say I find the player coach, I get that person on board. How do I manage that person in a way that allows them to be effective while also getting to the company outcomes we want? Because now we're in that 0 to 1 or $1 to $3 million range. So we're still putting the plane together while we're jumping off the cliff. So we need that player manager to be documenting process, building process while they're doing it. And so that's obviously can be very time consuming as an activity. And that means they're not managing people and they're not doing their quota. And I could easily see a situation where you go like weeks on end where that person just gets mired in the muck, trying to document with good intentions, but forgetting the other things. So like, how do you help to balance and maybe load balancing is the way to think about it, but how do you, as a CEO now, you've got this person, how do you make sure they're effective in driving home the outcomes that you need?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, and it is something that companies struggle with. I think the most important piece is probably during that recruitment process with your sales leader, your player coach, is defining what success looks like in that first 12-month period. So prioritizing, is revenue the most important thing that you can drive for the business? Structure will come in time, but do you need revenue desperately because your next raise is contingent on hitting certain metrics? Do you have some rigor around your process? Are you going to hire seasoned account executives because you know that realistically we're not going to put in a great playbook in our first 12 months? So we need people that can operate relatively independently, albeit with a manager, but they don't need that same hand holding through a process. Have they done deals end to end so that they don't need the involvement of other people? So I think it's thinking about, if structure is really important for you in your business, then you do have to realize that revenue is going to take a hit because there is only so much time in a day. And if you want to understand how that person focuses their time, it's what are the greater, the business objectives and how do they lead into that, and then work backwards as to what they should be spending their time on, and do that in a really consultative fashion. And that should be happening sort of through your interview process, where effectively you sit down with that candidate and the two of you agree, okay, this is how I'm going to measure whether you've had a good year one or not. And we both agree on it, and then we move forward. And then you're completely aligned and they know exactly where they should be spending their time. The biggest issues come around where there's not alignment. A sales leader thinks they should be doing something, the business thinks they should be doing something, the VCs think they're doing something else, and everyone's got different expectations. And so someone fails in a business, it's typically because they've misaligned the expectations of what that role should have been doing. So the clearer you can get on that, the more success you'll typically have. And that's what we where we try and work through that process with early stage companies, because quite often they just don't know. They don't know what their priorities should be. So you go back to where are your pressures coming from? What do we need to solve for with this role? And then let's figure out what the key metrics are for this person. And then we go recruit, and then we walk the person through how success will be defined for them so they know from day one.
Yeah, that's really a great perspective. Like, as you were talking through that, I was playing out my own experience at two different startups as a head of sales or VP of sales, whatever you want to call it. Because on one hand, when I was at Applia first starting off, it was just really like, we got to get the first $1 million or $2 million in revenue. So it was all hands on deck. And I had a team and I was managing them, but really it was the true player coach. Like, I had my own quota. I was traveling to accounts, and we hired experienced people that had sold in higher ed. I didn't need to babysit them. I could go 2 weeks without a substantial conversation. We'd check in and be like, okay, are you good? Yeah, I'm good. Where are you headed this week? I'm going here. Okay, cool. Let me know how it goes. Yep. And that allowed us to hit that first number. And there was playbook that kind of got built implicitly.
Yep.
Like product of, okay, well, this is what I'm doing with the demos. I'm like, oh, that's cool. So now that Deborah's doing this and Eric's doing that and I'm doing it this way, let's just make that the way that we all do demos and then share it with the rest of the team.
Yep.
Because hitting the revenue number, to your point, was way more important than like building out the playbook.
And you'll all innately understand what everyone is doing because the business is so small that you'll be talking so often anyway that you'll pick up little cues as to what people do, and you might hear a phone call that somebody else does and think, that's a great way to pitch the business, jot that down. And all of a sudden you're coming up with your playbook and your script for your salespeople, but it's happening organically because you're just, you're so closely aligned with one another, and you still will have regular catch-ups and talk about success. And at that size of business, everybody will know every deal that everyone else does, and they'll know how they did that deal. You just don't have enough scale where you're doing deals of a magnitude where, oh, I didn't know that Eric did that deal or Mike did that deal. You will know because, the size of the business. And that starts to breed repeatable behavior, which starts to build your process organically for you. yes, you may need to document that at some stage, but if you're already building a culture that has that process sort of inbuilt in it, then the next reps that come on, they start to pick up that culture organically and by osmosis of just, being around a sales team that all operates in a fairly singular way and realizing, what works and what doesn't work. But yeah, if you know that revenue is the pressure and you target revenue and everything else will take care of itself, all of the other pressures do start to go away and you think, right, okay, now we've hit that number, we've got a bit of breathing room so we can build some of this stuff that we were working on. And a lot of it you'll already have, you just need to document it.
Yeah, because that leads me to the second example. When I was at Altos, where I grew the sales there, brought in 2 sales reps, I was still managing the larger accounts, but then as the new ones are coming in, I was feeding them the new leads.
Yep.
And we could be a lot more patient with them. It was like so much more about playbook and process. And okay, Scott, like you got us to the first couple million in revenue. Like, how did you convert that deal with Morgan Stanley? How did you do that with TCW? And I'm like literally teaching them what I was doing, and we're just doing the playbook as I'm training them. We didn't have the urgency. We weren't funded. We were a bootstrap company, and we were making money. We could pay the bills. It wasn't this pressure to like, we got to raise in 6 months or we're out of runway.
Yep.
And so with them, it was the opposite of what I described at Apple. It was just like everything was playbook focused. I would sit down on calls with them, and pre-call, we're going to map out the call. Then we do the call, and post-call and map, what do we do? What happened?
Yep.
And it was just a very patient approach to it. And so I think, depending on the situation, like you said, you're going to have different outcomes. But for us, it was clear that to get out of that $2 million range to the next phase, we needed to get 2 more reps really performing at the enterprise level.
Exactly. And then you also have the power of customer feedback once you've been through that process as well, which, as a salesperson, you're selling how you think the customer wants you to sell a lot of the time. You're selling on the things that you think are most important. That 12 months later, you then have all of that great customer feedback of, okay, here are the things that we really need to nail on. So, building your playbook is almost more valuable after 12 months because you've got real world examples of customers and what they liked, what they didn't like, whether they will renew, why they won't renew. And you can build that into, who are the customers that we should be targeting to make sure we're going after the right customers and it's going to be repeatable business for us. And again, all of that becomes easier when you've had that pressure of whatever that initial pressure is taken away.
Yeah. I'd like to shift back to something we brought up a little bit earlier, because we talked about player coach. We also talked about head of sales, VP of sales, CRO, and you're paraphrasing. You said allowing yourself the room to hire above.
Yep.
And so there's this sort of ascension of you could hire somebody as a player coach that could move into a head of sales position, that could move into a VP, it could end up being your CRO, but maybe not.
Yep.
And so, a lot of questions that we get around this is like, if I hire a player coach, am I telling that person that they're being groomed for head of sales, or am I hire them for that job? And when that next need for a head of sales or VP of sales, then they will be considered along with other candidates. Like, how transparent, how should I be thinking about that to set the expectations? Because you could certainly bring somebody in that's more experienced and say, well, I'm willing to be a player coach for a little while, as long as I know you're going to put me into the VP of sales position in 2 years.
Yeah. And again, it's aligning expectations. In recruitment, all we do is try and align expectations. What does the client want out of this role, and what does the candidate want, for their next role, and try and align those. And so transparency is always really important. I think the reality is you'll never know if the person is going to be your VP of sales, but you always want to say to them, absolutely, you are the first person on ground. You will have every opportunity to go be that VP of sales. And we see it a lot. I mean, you look at a lot of startups and their VP of sales is somebody that has been with the business 4 or 5 years and started even as an account executive and worked their way through becoming sales manager, head of sales, and then they've, might have had a role in between and then became the VP of sales. So there is every likelihood that person could do it. I think you have to, once you realize whether or not they are likely to be that person. So if your organization is growing at a rate where there is too big of a gap as to their skill set and what you're going to need from the next role, is having transparent conversations with them about, we are going to go to market. you are more than welcome to apply for this role. Here's the gap that we see, and here's the role that we need to be recruiting for, and this is what we're going to go to market for. I've experienced it as an investor in tech businesses where I've had the head of sales want to go for a more senior role in the organization, and had a really honest chat with the CEO, and they still want to go through the process, which is great because it's a really good learning experience for them, and there's almost no downside to it. Yes, people can be upset because they didn't get the role, but if they then get the opportunity to learn from a really amazing VP of sales who can help them become a VP of sales, then that's the way you need to shape that conversation. Is if it's not you, it's because there's a gap there. This person's going to help close that gap for you so that you can be a VP of sales, with us or elsewhere. And, transparency helps every conversation. And, I think people shy away from those thinking, if I tell this person that they're unlikely to get the role, they're going to leave the organization. The reality is, if you hire the person, they're going to leave the business anyway, whether you have that conversation with them or not. If that's really the catalyst that makes them leave the business, at least do the right thing by them, and it will stand you in really good stead and build your relationship further.
Yeah, I think there's obviously this fear factor. At least for me, it would be like if I have somebody who's a really great player coach and they're producing and they've gotten us to a point where we've grown and closed the next round, and now we have to hire a VP of sales and they don't get that position, then they really have a choice on how they're going to react or respond to that situation. And they could say, okay, you're right, I'm not ready, but I'm willing to learn from this person. And if you're, like you said, even to say, look, if in 2 years another opportunity comes up for you somewhere else, and my job as a manager is to help you advance your own career. And that's obviously not something we would do 20 or 30 years ago. Be open about that. Like, hey, you're going to work here for 2 more years. We're going to get you promotable so you can leave. But I think that's the reality of today's workforce. And if they sour and like, oh, I should have been the VP of sales, then you're just going to have to make a hard decision and say, look, I'm sorry you didn't make it. You seem like it's not a good fit anymore. And you move them out of however painful that's going to be. That's going to be negative morale.
Yeah, and you just have to realize the business has to come first. The business is always the priority. Getting to the goal is always the priority. And you may have people that get upset along the way, but you have to stay focused on this is for the betterment of the business. And, we are striving towards this goal. And if that person feels a certain way based on that and they decide to leave the business, that is just part of the world that we live in. The reality is people don't spend 10, 15 years with organizations these days anymore. They look to progress, and then they look to move, and they look for the next opportunity. So you have to build into any of your planning that the reality is you will lose people as you grow as a business. Whether you could be the best boss in the world, you may not be able to create an opportunity for them. But like I say, if you handle it in the right way and you say, hey, I want to mentor you, I want this VP of sales to mentor you, look at what they've done. You're going to learn from an amazing person, and this will propel you in your career. And yes, it's a weird conversation to say we want to make you a VP of sales elsewhere, but it also just emboldens your employment brand in the market, because that person walks away saying, you know what, I didn't get that role, but man, were they fair to me, and they gave me an amazing opportunity, and I'm in the role that I'm in today because they treated me the way that they did. That message is so positive to go out into the market, and for any prospective employees that you may try and attract into your business, that it's cheesy, but doing the right thing is never the wrong thing. Like it's always good to try and do well by your employees, because you build your network, you create positive employment brand. And, I believe in a certain type of karma where if you do these right things, that, other good people will come back to you because they'll have a conversation with that person. You might be trying to find a CMO, and that person is talking to an amazing CMO and saying, look, they were an amazing business. They mentored me. They got me the role I am now. And that helps you get that CMO across the line. Then that was all worthwhile.
Yeah, totally agree. Well, I'd love to talk a little bit more about recruitment, so that we sort of set the stage on defining the roles and, this growth parameter from 0 to 1, 1 to 3, these different stages and steps of roles and responsibilities. So, we're going into next year. I know there's a lot of teams that, despite however difficult this year might have been, let's face it. I mean, the VC world has not let up on investing.
Nope.
Companies in the startup world are still growing. Digital transformation is a thing for real. And, there's a real bifurcation of the economy out there. I mean, you see people that are completely unemployed and in line for food stamps. And then you got startups that are hiring like crazy right now in the tech world. So, in our world, things are growing. So when you think about recruiting in this environment, I mean, not everybody's in Australia like you or New Zealand where everything is open for business for the most part. And so you have to recruit remotely, you have to hire remotely. And now you're in a position where it's not even just hiring an individual contributor, but you're hiring somebody you've got to manage who is managing people.
Yep.
And so you have this big daisy chain effect happening. So how are you approaching this, or how should teams be thinking about this process of setting yourself to recruit remotely to find this kind of talent that you need?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because we saw a real shift happen through COVID. So, when it first started, we had clients of ours, laying off entire sales and marketing teams and just, battening down the hatches, and this is the worst thing that possibly could have happened. And we've now come through the other side where, we're exceptionally busy from a recruitment perspective at the moment, which means there's a lot of confidence and, competition for talent is as intense now as it was pre-COVID, which is, hard to believe, as you say, given there are so many people that in other industries are really struggling to find employment at the moment. Tech really, has found its confidence again. I think people have got themselves into a mentality of recruiting remotely is now just what we need to do. And I may recruit people that I may not meet for a year, which, pre-COVID was just such a weird thing to think about. Even if you were, well, I mean, even if you were recruiting somebody who was, say you're in San Francisco and you're recruiting an account executive in New York, typically you're getting them on a plane and you're flying them to San Francisco to meet your team and, do a roundtable or have lunch and try and get them into the culture of the business. We can't do that anymore. So you're recruiting people that are just going to be out there as an island for the foreseeable future. And it almost hasn't impacted any level of recruitment as well. We've just completed a GM search for a UK business that's expanding into North America. And this is somebody that reports into the CEO. We're talking, close to 7-figure package for this person, not met a single person in person. And you think, that's crazy, right? That you would put so much emphasis and so much resource into somebody that hasn't met anybody in the organization. But it's the reality. It's hire that person or don't move forward as an organization. And that's the reality most tech businesses are facing is if we don't hire now, somebody will come and they will hire and they will get to market and they execute faster and better than we did because we waited to see if we could meet people in person. So I think organizations are now pretty comfortable. You've got to understand that probably the most difficult thing is getting people hooked into your culture as an organization. That's really difficult to do remotely. So what steps do you put into your process? I think it's really important to include people within the organization who are just team members to talk to people where it's not an interview. It's a really informal, get to know each other conversation where everybody can relax. It's just a casual conversation so this person can start to understand how the organization ticks. I think if you have everything that is assessment focused and they're always being watched and assessed to see whether they're the right person for the organization, you're never going to get that right fit. And they're always going to feel on edge with you as a business. Typically you would take them to lunch or go for a drink with them. Now you have to do that virtually, but have a conversation where the agenda is, what do you do on the weekend? What do you do outside of work? What's your family situation? What do you love? What sports teams do you follow? Why? And, what school did you go to? And all of this stuff that is really important in getting to know people, because the hook of the culture is an integral piece of the recruitment puzzle. And without being able to do that in person, you have to change your process to make sure you still get it, because people buy into the culture of an organization. They buy into the culture of the manager that they're reporting into, the CEO that they're going to be working for that's leading this organization. So everybody needs to up level their virtual charm, as cheesy as that sounds, because you really do have to, I think, put extra effort in when you are virtual than if you were in person with somebody. Your body language needs to be exaggerated. Your emphasis, your happiness, your enthusiasm for them as a candidate, everything needs to be up leveled so that they can get that sense and so they feel the buy-in from you as a business. A really common piece of feedback I get at the moment is candidates finish an interview process and they just don't know how they did. They got no feedback in the interview. They didn't get any sense that the hiring manager was happy, that they'd answered the questions well, that they felt they were a good fit. And I'm then coming back to them with glowing feedback from the hiring manager and they're like, oh, had no idea. And in their mind, they've already started to discount the opportunity because they didn't get that sense. And they think me as a recruiter is trying to spin. They think that I'm just trying to keep this warm and keep them in process because they've just not felt that direct feedback. And so I think, at the end of an interview, tell a candidate that you think they're great. Why do you think they're great? Why do you think they're right for the role? What are the things that you really stood out to you? What are the answers that you loved? What are the areas that for the next conversation you think are important to drill into because you didn't get all of the information you needed? So just being really overt, very clear with your communication, and as I say, up leveling everything from a virtual love perspective to make that person really feel it.
Are you finding, related to this, that the interview process is generally longer or shorter now because everything is virtual? Because I can remember when I was going to Applia, they were recruiting me from New York, going to San Francisco. And we had to book like 4 weeks in advance for me to fly out there. And then 2 days before I was supposed to fly, I found out I had to teach a workshop at the home office in New York. So I'm like, I can't come. So it was like 2 more weeks before I could fly out there versus today's world. It's like, oh, let's do a Zoom on Friday. Yeah. So is it compressed or is it still the same length because we have to add more steps because of this lack of interpersonal? I'm curious about how that's going for you.
The timeline has condensed is probably what I've seen most commonly. And I think it's because people's availability has increased dramatically working from home. They don't need to have a doctor's appointment or a dentist appointment to get out of the office for their interviews. They can schedule a Zoom whenever they have free time in their calendar. So you're not having scheduling conflicts, like you experience where you've got to fly somewhere and that takes a lot of process to organize everything around that with you being there. A Zoom is very easy to organize. And we're almost having to say to companies, you need to slow the process down a little bit because thinking about leaving a current company is a really emotional process for people to go through, and they need time to process their feelings about leaving that job. And if you try and do that in an accelerated fashion, you just risk them not having time to go through that. And when you get to point of offer, they're still not sure about the attraction of this role versus the role that they're in at the moment. So there is a real sweet spot of kind of that 3 to 4 week process that I think is nailed on as being a really good timeline. It's fast enough that you're still moving at a decent pace. Everything can happen within a month, which is great, but it's not too quick that people feel rushed into decision making. And I think from the hiring manager side, people just have Zoom fatigue as well, and they think about jumping on another Zoom call and another Zoom call with the candidate, and they're trying to limit the number of steps in a process so they don't have as many Zoom calls to get this person over the line. But again, you need to make sure that candidate is getting buy-in to you as a business, and that involves time, and it involves multiple conversations sometimes, which I know with all of us sitting in front of our laptops all day every day can be quite tiresome, but that investment is going to pay dividends in terms of getting the candidate that you really want, as opposed to trying to abridge a process in a week and a half, make an offer, you get an acceptance, they get a counter offer, and they stay where they are because they never really mentally left the role that they were in.
So how much are you forecasting and future pacing for candidates what the process is? And the reason I ask that, like going back to the olden days where we can meet people in person, it's sort of like phone screen, first call, then maybe do like a phone interview. Then it's kind of like the face-to-face coffee. And then maybe it's like a a full day on site, and it's sort of this crescendo leading up to the on site. And then you kind of know after that, okay, we're going to get an offer or not. And so it's like pretty deliberate. Everybody kind of knows intuitively this is the process. But now you don't have that full day. It might be scattered across a week or two because of schedules and Zooms and all that. So are you forecasting with clients, both the people that are getting hired, the sales leaders, and the hiring teams? Like, let's document this so everybody's really clear.
Yep. Again, I feel like I keep using the same term, but again, it's expectation setting. So having everybody aligned as to how long a process should take. And we get really clear with the companies we work with, defining their process down to every individual that will be in that interview process and over what time period they will come into that interview process, and try to stick to that process, as strictly as you can to mitigate things dragging, things jumping around, and also just people changing process ad lib. Because what we try and do is we try and then say to the candidate, this process will go for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And here's the stages you can expect as you progress through the organization. Here's the individuals that you will meet as part of this process, so that they can go and do as much of their prep as possible to get to know, more about the backgrounds of these people. Because I think never has research on the people that are going to be interviewing you been more important than now, because you don't get that sit down coffee, team lunch environment. So you kind of, you need to be scanning LinkedIn and, picking up common themes that you want to talk to them about, or things that you can pull out as part of your interview with them. Because I say to salespeople, an interview process, you should treat like a sales process. What prep would you do prior to speaking to a potential client? You should be doing exactly the same process prior to speaking to a potential hiring manager. You should know everything about them. You should know everything about the business. You should have done really good research so that when you're in that conversation, you're fully armed. And they can only do that if they know, okay, here's the steps and here are the people that you're going to be meeting. And so that's why we do look to define process, because it will impact success or otherwise. If you try and move processes around, add people into a process, you're not sure, so you want to get Jim and Bill to put their 2 cents in as well, it just sends a message to the candidate, hey, we don't really know what we're looking for here, and we're just not sure whether you're the right fit. And they just start to get uninterested in the opportunity, because there always seems to be something else that they need to do, another hoop to jump through. And with the amount of competition, you'll just lose them as a candidate.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I could totally see that happening too, because it's so easy. As much as there's Zoom fatigue, it's so easy to just say, oh, let's do one more Zoom, versus like, hey, we're going to do the on-site. We're going to fill up the dance card, and whoever's here is going to meet the candidate. We're not going to ask the candidate to come back, especially if they're traveling across the country. It's like, this is the day where everybody's going to meet everybody.
Yep.
And with the way we are now, it's easy to just make that day turn into a month easily. So.
And it's definitely added a level of complexity, because those days were so great for people to sit down and really get a sense for everybody, and even just be in the office and kind
the
of
vibe. How do people people? Like, how are they communicating? How's the product team talking to the product team over there?
Are people smiling in the office? Totally. Really, really cliched things like that, where you get a sense of the energy that's, is it dead quiet in there? Like, I'm going in as a salesperson and nobody's talking. Like, what is going on here? And is this an environment that I could see myself in? Those days are so critical. And I like to think they'll be back in the not too distant future, even if remote working becomes, it looks as though it is going to become more commonplace, and a lot of organizations are now comfortable with remote working. I still think there's a lot of people, myself included, who are pining to get into an office to be around people, because that energy that you get from being in an office environment, you cannot replicate no matter how many Zoom calls you do, or Slack, or however many communication channels you have. So I like to think those days will come back, but organizations can't wait to do their hiring then. They need to get really good at this process. This process may become redundant, but that's fine. Get really good at it now, and then change as we need to when things return to normality.
Yeah, you sort of prefaced the last question we have time for, which is how remote do you recommend people hiring for? So like, and right now, at least here in the States, right, everything is remote.
Yep.
But let's just say that at some point we're going to go back to an office environment in some way, shape, or form. So I'm hiring, if I'm based in the Bay Area or in Austin or wherever, I'm going to hire whoever I hire. It's going to be remote.
Yep.
But should I be hiring with an eye on somebody who can come into the home office that will eventually come back to pass?
Yep.
Or is it truly, look, we're based in the Bay Area. We have a great candidate in Miami, so we're just going to hire that person?
Yeah, I mean, my advice to most of because 90% of the customers that I deal with are still US based. And I would say that the most common piece of feedback I give them is don't limit yourself by geography, because there is amazing talent out there. And now that we are in this mindset that remote works and it can work quite well, if you have an amazing candidate and they are in a location that you hadn't considered previously, I wouldn't discount them based on that being the deal breaker. I think for sales teams, this is going to be a really interesting evolution of the sales team, where so much of, I guess, what drives a sales team is being together for the most part, is, everybody feeding off the energy of, Jeff just did a deal and it's 300K ARR and that's amazing. Let's celebrate that deal. That elevates all the rest of the team. And that stuff, yes, you can get an email that Jeff did the deal. You don't feel the same way that you do, if someone's ringing a bell in the corner and those sorts of things. So, I think you have to understand the type of salespeople that you're going to be hiring. If you're going to be hiring relatively junior salespeople, the reality is it's probably most important that they are close to the head office and that manager is close to them. If you're hiring really seasoned account executives because you're going after enterprise, Fortune 500 customers, and these are people that do not need hand-holding and would probably get frustrated with a manager who is looking over their shoulder every day, then hire remotely. And, even look at your leadership roles to be remote. Try have some, geographic bearing. So, hire a sales leader to be your East Coast sales leader, hire somebody to be your West Coast sales leader, so that you can get people together. Because I still do think it's really important to get people together. And in the US, there is very few places you can't jump on a plane and get to in a relatively short space of time. So even if you do hire that person remotely, you can still bring them into town, once, twice a month for 3 or 4 days and get everybody around and get a lot of, the energy that you want and build and structure and get that team camaraderie, and then start to separate again and be remote. Because, based on what I was saying with the moving trucks in San Francisco, I think there is a real change happening now where people don't feel they need to be in the Bay Area to be part of the tech scene anymore.
Yeah, we're seeing Austin is just exploding right now. You're seeing all these companies move out of the Bay Area. So.
And Austin, definitely Austin's been a pretty busy tech hub for quite a while. And, you've got much more favorable tax environments and various other things where, as an organization, you look at it and say, we could pay somebody in the Bay Area 100K. We could pay them that in Austin, and they're going to take home far more money. So you've got a far happier person by hiring that person in Austin. So you are going to see a disbursement of talent that's never happened before. And no doubt, sort of costs of being a tech business, I think, will come down, because you don't need 3 chefs on staff anymore. You don't need in-house masseuses. You don't need, all of these ancillary benefits that organizations felt were an essential to have, and why, in my opinion, so many tech companies burn through cash at the rate that they do, because they feel they need to keep up with the Joneses, the Facebooks and the Googles who have these amazing benefits. And so they burn through cash trying to do these things. I think now they'll be able to utilize that money much more effectively, either up-leveling the hiring that they were going to do, or increasing the hiring, or even just providing other benefits that individually are much more attractive to the people that you're hiring. But I think organizations have to prepare themselves that the expectation now for candidates is remote is okay. And that there's almost a perception that if it's not okay, that you're not necessarily that forward-thinking tech business that they want to be a part of. But again, think about the role that you're hiring and the people that that are going to be underneath that person and what's going to be most important. There are still going to be plenty of people in the Bay Area to hire. So, it's not as if you are completely discounting every salesperson by saying we just want to hire in the Bay Area. There'll still be Silicon Valley is not going to die. It might change and there might be some people leave, but there'll still be a lot of amazing talent, and predominantly talent that has been there, done that in the Bay Area more than anywhere else. But, just, I guess, open up your horizons to think about remote and what talent you could get for maybe better money. If you hired somebody in Austin that you'd have to pay 180, 200,000 in the Bay Area, you might get them for 150 in Austin or Colorado or, somewhere else. So it could be budgetary wise, it could be beneficial too.
Yeah. And to your point, I mean, even if you say, look, I want my leader to be within a 2-hour flight or a 3-hour flight, if you're based in the Bay Area still, there's LA and Phoenix and Austin and Denver and Seattle and Portland and Boise. I mean, there's plenty of places to find people.
And they've all got huge amounts of great talent. So you're not limiting yourself. And I'm not saying you're a Bay Area team, go hire a New York sales leader that you're not going to see very often. Be sensible about it. But you can now, you can have people in locations that you don't need to set up an office in as well. You can have, individual contributors that are spread around the country and contribute. And, there are clients all around the country as well. So, beneficial to have people in locations where they can visit
totally.
people.
You're like, wow, now we have a reason to hire somebody on the East Coast to handle the East Coast accounts. We don't have to have somebody come into the office at 6:30 in the morning.
Yeah, exactly.
Hire them based out of the East Coast. So, dude, this has been awesome. I have, 20 more questions that we could go through. You obviously know your stuff, which is why we had you on the show. And so appreciative of your time because I know you're busy in this time of year. So
it's been my pleasure, Scott. And I'd be more than happy to come back. And, if you had any feedback from your client base and, people have got specific questions that they want to go into and you want to have another conversation and dig into some of the rest of the things, because I know recruitment's tough. I've been doing it 15 years and I love and hate it every day. So I completely get that it's a really tough thing to get right, but it's an essential thing to get right. So if I can help with some of the, experience and mistakes that I've seen made and made myself, and that would be beneficial, I'd be more than happy to come back and talk again.
That would be great. So for everybody, I know it's the Search X, and that's EX. So it's short for the search experience. So the searchx.com. Is that the best place for people to go? Or is there other places where they can?
Yeah, no, the SearchX, we redid our website over COVID. So go and check it out.
Beautiful.
And, as most organizations, we redid all our tech stack during the downtime. So yeah, check it out. And I'm sure you'll share my contact details if people want to reach out and get in contact, and even, individually want to have a chat about some of the things we covered. I'm always happy to talk to people. I love talking to people and helping people with their recruitment as much as I can.
Yeah. And while you're based in Australia, we talked about this a little bit, you work quite a lot with Silicon Valley firms. You have a business partner that's based here in San Francisco or in the Bay Area as well. Is that right?
I do, yeah. We've got a team based in, they're spread out at the moment. We've got people in Tahoe and various other places.
Right.
One is in Vegas at the moment just because he's driving around the place. But so predominantly the team is based in the US, and even though I operate from Sydney, I still mostly deal with US-based customers. I start my days pretty early here in Sydney to catch the West Coast and sometimes catch the East Coast as well. And the beauty of everybody being remote is me being in Sydney doesn't typically matter too much. So
yeah, look, the time zone is actually not that bad. We have clients in Australia and New Zealand. Like right now, the time zone in New Zealand is only 3 hours difference. It just happens to be tomorrow.
Yes,
so for you, I know
exactly.
It's only 5 hours. So.
I have a 2.5-year-old and a 7-month-old. So if I'm asleep past 5 o'clock, then something amazing has happened with both of my children.
Yeah,
so.
Like what happened? They slept through the night. Well, look, man, it's so good to have you on the show. We'll definitely have your contact details as soon as we have the show up and post it. We'll share it with you so you can share it with your tribe. I would love to have you come and do a part 2 or maybe do something specific with our clients. So really
Brilliant.
glad you can make the time.
My pleasure, Scott.
Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All
Cheers.
Right, cheers. Bye.
Bye.
All right, folks, that's a wrap. So enjoyed that conversation with Jeremy. As I talked with him after our conversation, how much I appreciated that we really dove into the nooks and crannies of that sales hiring process, because I know how difficult it is for so many startup founders to get through that first hiring process, building out that sales team, finding that first sales leader, figuring out what does it mean to have a player coach? What is the job that needs to be done? How do you measure? And how do you think about the expansion of that role, the leadership roles in your sales and marketing organization? So really excited that we had Jeremy today. Listen, I also appreciate that you're listening to this podcast. If you made it this far in the recording, that means you're digging the content and appreciating the content that we're pushing out there each and every week, if not more often. So I would love it if you could head over to Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify, wherever you're listening to this show, leave a review for us. Let us know how we're doing. Let other people know how much you enjoy the show, what you enjoy about that show. If you've got some guests that you want to recommend for us, put those right into the reviews as well. We'll do our very best to reach out to those people, because we want to make sure that we're pumping out content that's useful for you each and every day as you're out there trying to ramp up and scale up your sales process at your startup. So that's it for now. Thanks so much for listening. We'd love to hear from you. Leave a review. Tell a friend or 10 about the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. And in the meantime, that's me, Scott Sambucci, signing off.